think of some things that you want me to expand on a little bit. One other housekeeping thing, everybody comes into the room, and if you've been to these before, which you may have since it's late in the day on Monday, everybody has their screens turned off and their microphones turned off so we can kind of corral the bandwidth so that everybody gets the best experience that we can give you. Thank you everybody for being here. Thank you to the organizers of the Data for Impact conference for having me here. My name is Beth Pluchak, as Erin introduced me. My pronouns are she and her. I am a writer and a consultant. I have been working with small businesses and economic development agencies for over 20 years. And for the last 10 years, I've been doing a lot of work around the theory of complex adaptive systems and how complex adaptive systems gives us a framework to understand how change happens. And that's a little bit of what I'm going to be talking about here. Before I start the talk, I also want to acknowledge that I'm talking to you from Prairie du Sac, Wisconsin, on the ancestral land of the Ho-Chunk and the Sauk peoples. I also want to add a little content warning because everybody is so emotionally frayed right now with everything that's going on. And given the topic of Black lives, I promise you I'm not going into any graphic detail, but I will be mentioning a number of people who have died. And if you find even the list of that name traumatizing, then I would like you to do whatever you need to do to protect yourself. See if I can pull the screen share up. Okay, Black Lives Matter. Why this time is different? Well, that begs the question, doesn't it? Is this time different? I mean, is it really, really different? Or is it another iteration of something we've seen so many times before? And in order to answer that question, I'm going to tell you a little bit more of my story, a little bit more about myself. So as I mentioned, I'm talking to you from Prairie du Sac on the other side of the Wisconsin River. I've spent most of my life in small towns, rural towns in the Midwest in Wisconsin. And so that's kind of the history I bring and the perspective I bring to my experience. I grew up in the 1960s. Yeah, I'm going to go back that far, but hang on there. I will bring us up to the present pretty quickly. But I want to start in the 1960s when I was 10 years old. At night, when I went to bed, I listened on the radio to the freedom riders, to the bus rides down to the southern United States as part of the drive to overturn the disenfranchisement of Black people and to get Black people registered to vote in the southern states. And I was listening to this at the ages of 10, 11 in real time as this was happening. And that formed my knowledge of how much racial injustice there is in this country. But like I said, I was, a white kid growing up in a white community. I don't think I met a Black person until I was in my 20s. But I'm going to fast forward again a little bit to the Rodney King beating and the riots surrounding Rodney King, because that was another incident that I was very aware of. And it was very obvious to me that whatever people said about provocation, it was so unjust. Whatever people said about what kind of a person Rodney King may or may not have been, it was just undeniably unjust. The next time one of these incidents had a really big impact on me was, fast forward, I guess, to Trayvon Martin's murder. Trayvon Martin. So by the time Trayvon Martin was murdered in Florida, I had a biracial grandson that was Trayvon's age. Our Riley, my Riley, is the same age Trayvon would be if he were alive today. And my Riley was growing up in a really white community, small town community in Wisconsin, where he was being raised by his white mother and his white stepdad. He was one of only 2 Black kids at his school, his high school, and he was also the only Asian kid at his high school. So from the time he was old enough to walk back and forth to school by himself, as white people, we became aware of how much harassment he faced on a daily basis, which was new to us in a white community. So Trayvon could so easily have been Riley. So by this time, it wasn't just injustice in a generalized sense, it was becoming personal. When, in my introduction to this, if you read the description of this talk, I started with George Floyd's murder as kind of the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement. And when George Floyd was murdered, it was another one that raised my awareness in a lot of levels. And I took it upon myself to learn a lot about police violence against people of color, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in this country. At the time, the narrative in my community around Michael Brown's murder was, you need, and many of you have heard all these before, you need to get the whole story, you need to hear both sides. He robbed a grocery store. He actually went into a grocery store and walked out with, if it was him, if it was even him, that was never proven. But let's say for argument's sake, it was him. He walked out with a $5 item. So like in my town, if a teenager walks into the Piggly Wiggly and walks out with a $5 item, we do not call that strong-armed robbery, we call that shoplifting. What Michael was murdered for, I mean, besides the obvious of being Black, was jaywalking. Like, I grew up knowing you weren't supposed to jaywalk, but I didn't even think you could get a ticket for it, much less get arrested for it, much less get murdered for it. So the next one that really hit me was Tony Robinson here in Madison. He was murdered for the crime of being high and disorderly in a college town on a Friday night. So think about that for a minute. He was murdered right around the corner from the house my daughter owns and was living in at the time. So his murder, again, was very, very personal to our family. So then we go ahead to George Floyd, which was a murder that finally seemed to make an impact in the larger society, that finally seemed to demand a response from the larger society. And there's been a lot of news, blogs, articles about why that happened. And it certainly, again, had an impact on me and on my family. But I am telling you all of this about me and about my history, not to share how woke I may or may not be. Anyway, just a hint, if white people use the word woke, then we're not real woke. But I wanted to lay the story out in that particular way because it makes sense in that way, that there were a series of events and that over time, the impact of these events became stronger and stronger and had a stronger impact. And I think that's kind of the story we've been telling about how the larger public, and by the larger public, I mean white communities, the press, business, and politicians became invested in talking about the injustice surrounding George Floyd's murder. But talking about it in a linear fashion gives the wrong impression of how we come to a point of change. There's a mechanical linear way of looking at change, and there's a biological way of looking at change. And what I want to do today is give you the framework for that biological way of looking at change, because it will help you do two things. It will help you understand the impact of what's going on in society today, and it will help you in your lives, in your institutions, in your enterprises, have more of an impact on what change happens going forward from here. So this crab here is half mechanical, half biological. The difference between mechanical and biological systems thinking is that a mechanical system moves in a linear fashion. Organizations that have a structure that follow a more mechanical model tend to be hierarchical and top down. Whereas biological systems are more than the sum of their parts. One of the things that it's easy for us as human beings, given the way we're used to talking about events, and given this kind of linear narrative, which we tend to develop in talking about events, we miss that it's not the events themselves, it's the interactions between events that cause change. So my thinking on this, my knowledge on the biological systems aspect of change goes back to the first time I heard about the Santa Fe Institute. So the Santa Fe Institute is, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just to give you a little bit of the history of how people develop some of this theory, how people develop some of these frameworks, and some language to talk about it and think about it. So what happened in Santa Fe in the early 1980s was they put together a group of scientists to come together and share an interdisciplinary approach to talking about their discipline. It was way back in the 18th century that the different disciplines kind of became siloed in education, and physics went one way, and biology went its own way, and economics went one way, social sciences went one way, and they didn't communicate with each other. And economics and social sciences, economics in particular, tend to continue to follow a mechanistic linear way of looking at the way society evolves. And what happened at Santa Fe was, when these people started talking to each other in an interdisciplinary approach, they realized that there was a lot being left out of the conversation, because some sciences had evolved in certain ways where the social sciences, economics and social sciences, politics, were left behind. I would actually recommend, if people are interested in this history, to go ahead and Google Santa Fe, Google the Santa Fe Institute. It is still there since the 1980s, and they've been doing a lot of deep in the weeds data mining to talk about some of the issues that are of interest to us here at this conference. So what I want to give you to build kind of your own framework to get away from the linear mechanical way of thinking about change is some of the characteristics of self-organizing complex adaptive systems. I forgot to fix my slide. That should be adaptive, not adaption. So And those of you with an IT background have talked about this, I'm sure, have some familiarity with this kind of a systems analysis, or a systems analysis that's somewhat similar, where we're talking about networks and we're talking about nodes on networks. But in social systems, we also want to talk about self-contained networks. And we want to talk about feedback loops within those networks and between those networks. And we also want to talk about the science of emergence, because emergence is the place where new things happen. So one of the things I want you to think about, and maybe if you have some comments about your own organizations, your own enterprises, in terms of the way they're organized, and if they take into account any of these self-organizing complex characteristics. One of the first things to think about is your organization organized in a hierarchical manner from the top down, or is it organized from the bottom up? So if it's organized from the bottom up, there is a lot less ability to control what happens in an organization, but there's a lot more capability for emergence to happen. So just kind of think about that while we go forward. And if you have any comments or questions, pop them into the chat and I will get back to those at the end. So I talked about my linear trajectory in terms of my awareness of racial injustice and racial violence in this country. But it's not a linear trajectory. It actually operates more like this. It's a series of events, and you can take this kind of a model down to the individual level, where it's individuals interacting, it's individuals having conversations, but you can see there's some kind of clusters in these models, in this model as well. And so there's a lot more activity in between the nodes, which in this model are individuals, and the societies or the groups that they're a part of. And then there's some connections across some of these groups. So in order just to simplify it a little bit for purposes of understanding, I'm going to take a look at two network structures within this overall map of society, how society interacts. And I'm going to talk about self-contained networks. So my society out here on the right, the largely white society that I live in small town Wisconsin, has connections on certain levels between the individuals in the society. We're definitely segregated from multiracial communities, even outside of the fact of how segregated Wisconsin is. We are super segregated out here in the sticks where I am right now. So that's one of the things that informs the way that we see society operating. It informs our experience. It informs our sense of what it means to be safe, and it informs our sense of fairness. And the fact that this is such a self-contained network is a lot of the reason why there has been so much pushback against the narrative surrounding Black Lives Matter. So, you know, just kind of the common things that you hear where people respond with, well, all lives matter. Or people respond with, well, we have to know everything that happened. A lot of that has to do with the fact that in the segment of white society I'm talking about, and I'm not going to bring in the overtly racist parts of society. I'll bring it in by inference a little bit later, but I'm going to talk more directly about people who, white people tend to think we can pick and choose. I know after Donald Trump was elected, Sauk County was a borderline state. I think Trump won Sauk County by a couple of hundred votes. He lost in Prairie du Sac, the town I live in, by a handful of votes. I mean, it's really, really close. And talking to people afterwards, it's a very Catholic society out here. I mean, Catholic church. And most of the people that voted for Trump voted on the single issue of abortion and thought they could separate that issue from all of the other things that Trump surrounded himself and that Trump stood for. I remember having one conversation with somebody, if you all remember, right after the election, there was an upswing in hate crimes in Madison. And the language around racist hate became more acceptable, more open. And I remember a friend saying to me, well, we're not like that. She was appalled, but she couldn't see the connection between her vote and that kind of a society, because she still had this experience that in general, communities are fair. And if they're not fair, then it's some weird outlier. So anyway, enough on that. Black Lives Matter, at the same time, my community is trying to kind of make sense of what's going on in the world and dealing with information that's coming into us. Black Lives Matter has been very, very, very busy. When you go back to the murder of Michael Brown, that was kind of a turning point. And I'm going to lose the names here. The three young women. Black Lives Matter was founded by three young women. Here it is: Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, Patrisse Cullors, who started Black Lives Matter as a hashtag on Twitter. And young women. So they were directly impacted by Trayvon Martin's murder. And this murder, Michael Brown's murder, was like the one too many. It was the one too many they couldn't bear. And they decided they had to turn their lives upside down and do something about it. One of the things that's particularly important about the Black Lives Matter movement is it has always been structured as a bottom-up thing. There is no centralized movement. People have broken off in different parts, had agreements, and gone off and done the work in their own way. One of the problems with white progressives, one of the biggest problems white progressives have is this idea that change is linear and progressive, and we're always getting to the next best thing. And so we have to absolutely agree on tactics. And infighting is not to be tolerated. Black Lives Matter, the people of color, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color involved in that movement didn't have the luxury of the distance of organizing hierarchical structures. They needed to respond, and they needed to respond quickly. And a lot of what they did went largely unnoticed in the greater white society, and went largely, when it was noticed, it was dismissed or vilified. But if you see this self-contained network over here, Black Lives Matter, you see people in there busy doing the work. They're involved in direct action. They're involved in institution building. Here in Madison, the organization Young, Gifted, and Black sprang up at the same time as Black Lives Matter and took on some issues of dealing with disparity in Black lives, in Black lives, in outcomes, in educational outcomes, in interactions with the police. And from that organization, We've actually seen Freedom Inc. has come from that. Urban Triage has come from that. And in terms of institution building, what we've seen over that period of time is we've seen local community activists have not only been building movements, they've been building their own knowledge and toolkit and ability to engage in actions. There's been a lot of data collection going on when people have talked about policing as an issue. There are groups out there collecting data on how policing is different in different communities. In my community, a white person runs into a cop when you get a traffic ticket or when there's some kind of a community fundraiser and they show up to build community engagement. We have very, very little other contact with the police. And a lot of our image of what policing is about is really driven by TV and movies and kind of this hero story around who the police are. A very, very different experience than people in predominantly Black communities that, you know, looking at even Milwaukee and Madison and the way Black people are treated by police, the experience is just so different. And what happens, as long as these networks are kind of self-contained, is it's very hard for people in white society to kind of square that circle in our minds as to how that lived experience can be so different. One of the reasons for that is there's kind of a need to believe that the world is basically just, and things that interfere with our idea of a just world, we've got to find some reason for it, and we often look for external reasons for it. So at the same time, though, I want to bring you into the second characteristic of complex adaptive systems, which is feedback loops. So you have feedback loops going on within these different self-contained networks. So you have Black Lives Matter, which is composed of a lot of people doing some very, very grassroots work, study, getting information out, and that's kind of happening in that space. In white spaces, it's a little bit different because we don't have as much direct interaction between the people that are involved in the Black Lives Matter movement. So after Donald Trump was elected president, if you all remember, the Women's March. So the Women's March was a big thing. It was predominantly, almost totally white women demonstrating against Trump's election on the single issue of misogyny, because, you know, that's kind of our history as white feminists, is we pick a single issue and then everybody's got to be committed to that issue. And misogyny is a tough one because we never mean misogynoir. We always mean misogyny against white women. So the other thing that happened that was really striking to me was, as these marches were being organized and as these marches were taking place, there was one in Madison, one in Milwaukee, there was one in Valdez, Alaska. There was kind of a narrative that rose around these demonstrations, and that narrative was, well, if you're peaceful enough, if you're peaceful, you can have a demonstration where there is no police violence. Totally disregarding the actual lived experience of Black, Indigenous people of color in this country. And I knew women at the time who were very proud of themselves for being able to march peacefully. At the same time, I think this was just a day or two after the Women's March in Madison, Young, Gifted, and Black had a demonstration around the issue of free the 350. I forget the exact number, but the bail fund. And only a handful of people showed up for that. And I asked a friend of mine, like, if you believe in this, if you believe in this kind of direct action, why didn't you show up at the city county building for this action? And she told me that, well, she liked some of the things that Black Lives Matter stood for, but she couldn't get behind all of the things, which struck me as a little odd at the time, because my reading of it is Black Lives Matter stands for one thing only, and that's simply stop killing us. Stop killing us. That's it. That's the whole agenda. Everything other than that is tactics. So what happens then in terms of these feedback loops? I've always felt that one of my responsibilities as a white activist, I won't call myself an ally, that the term ally, well, I'm a Cold War baby. So I grew up during the Cold War, and the message, of course, is the ally in this war is often your enemy in the next war. I heard Brandy Grayson use the phrase co-conspirator, and I kind of like that. I wouldn't mind being a co-conspirator. So my job is to be part of the feedback loop between what a Black Lives Matter movement is doing and what people think it's doing here in white society, here in the white society in which I live in. And those feedback loops have to take into account this idea of the just world. One of the things that happened with George Floyd's murder was that there was no way to justify it. And you have to kind of wonder, because there were so many before Mr. Floyd, that there was no way to justify it. But part of that is that there was this feedback going back and forth between these closed networks, and the narrative was changing. So I did, one of the things that I look at is changes in narrative. And what I look at when I do this is I'm looking at headlines, I'm looking at news reports, I'm looking at comments sections, and I'm looking at social media to see how narratives about events are changing. So one of the things that happened is it took about a week for stories about Michael Brown's murder to start appearing in the national press, in the mainstream press. The initial reports referred to it as a shooting. And the initial reports used the kind of framework that the press likes, that, you know, you have to have a balanced view. You have to see all sides. You have to get all the information in, you know, on and on with that. So that took about a week before that conversation even started happening in the larger community. Trayvon Martin, and I'm not going linearly here, but that's okay. He was murdered in 2012. It took a month for stories about that incident, that murder in Florida, to start making the national press. And headlines and conversations around Trayvon's murder referred to it as a shooting and a tragedy. So by the time we get to George Floyd, that kind of blew up immediately. The news was talking about it the next day. It was being talked about on social media before then, and people were calling it murder immediately. And that's a huge, it may not seem like it, but it's a huge jump in the narrative in white communities and business communities to call these murders of Black people murders. I personally found it very difficult, and I had to work at it to get comfortable calling Michael Brown's murder a murder. I had to work at it to become comfortable to call Tony Robinson's murder a murder, even though I felt like he was somebody my kids knew. My daughter worked with one of his roommates. He was an acquaintance, not a friend, but that one was close, and it was hard for me to call it murder, again, for being high and disorderly in a college town on a Friday night. When George Floyd was murdered, people started calling it murder right away. So we're seeing a major change in the narrative. And that change is happening because along with the other activities that the Black Lives Matter movement has done since Michael Brown's murder, is they've been building a narrative around how to talk about these incidents. And they've been building a response around how to talk about their lived experience and how it differs from the lived experiences of people in small white towns. And what happens in complex adaptive systems, when you start seeing this information flowing from one closed network to another closed network, is it changes things, and it changes more than just kind of a one-on-one change. So I'm going to have another question. If you're in the audience, and if you're a white person, well, if you're not in the audience, you can hear me, but if you're in the audience, if you're a white person, think about the first time you became aware of the injustice of one of these murders of a marginalized person, whether it was by the police or anyone, but a murder of a marginalized person that struck you, the injustice of it struck you. Think about that a little bit, and think about the language around it in your community and the way people talked about it, and maybe think about how that changed, how that has changed over time. And if you want to put that in the comments too, we can talk about that shortly. In a little bit, we'll get to comments. These arrows between these enclosed networks here in the language of biological systems are called bridges, because these connections are actually extremely strong. And just for the sake of terminology here, in biology, the fact they're a bridge means information is accelerating in the way it's passing from one network to another. It does not mean in the way those of us in social justice movements, particularly in white progressive movements, talk about bridges. It has nothing to do with marginalized people having to build bridges between communities. This is an organic thing that happens. And that takes us to the question of why this time is different, why it's not just a cumulative difference that people reacted to. What happens in biological systems is, as these networks become more and more connected, they start changing, and individual interactions develop an emergent structure. So whereas before, at the time that Michael Brown was murdered, it was very, very difficult for white people to talk about his death as a murder. It became easier. And all of a sudden there's a space, and there's a language, and there's a narrative for white people to talk about Black lives and violence against Black bodies in a way that feeds into our idea of what is a just society, and what is fair, what is safe. And this space is emerging. So that's kind of the place we are now. I wanted to give plenty of time for discussion, because I want to add just one other thing. When you have an emergent structure, it's not guaranteed. It's not guaranteed that we're going to end up in a better place. That's kind of a holdover idea from this idea of progressivism, of things always progressing to a better place. It means there's room. There's room for society to move right now in a more just direction. And we're already seeing pushback. We've been seeing the pushback against that for a long time. There are very self-contained networks of overtly racist people that are pushing very, very hard against society changing at all. There are networks of people who, like the people who are refusing to wear masks in the midst of a pandemic, just can't deal with change, so they're in denial. So this, again, just a reminder, this is what it looks like across the board. So there's positive feedback loops, there's negative feedback loops, and there's bridges, there's natural bridges between networks, and all of this is going on. And we are living through kind of a trifecta of chaos right now, where we have the pandemic, we have economic precarity being pushed to extreme levels, even though we thought they were extreme a year ago. They're really, really extreme right now. And we have racism and violence against Black, Indigenous, and other people of color in a place where it's really, really hard for a lot of people who would prefer to ignore it to actually be able to ignore it. So the edge of chaos, where we're actually living right now, that's kind of not a metaphorical statement, although it makes a good metaphor. It's actually a physical phenomenon. And I'm going to just kind of give you quickly the classic example of the edge of chaos in physics is if you put a pot of water on the stove, it just sits there being water. But as soon as you apply heat and pressure, that water starts bubbling and it starts boiling. And if you continue to apply heat and pressure, that water will eventually turn to gas. And you'll never know at any moment in time which individual droplet of water will turn into gas or when it will turn into gas. But that's where we are now. We're at that kind of an edge of chaos. This is M. Mitchell Waldrop. If you look him up, he chronicled the history of the Santa Fe Institute in a book simply called Complexity. He talks about, I can't read you my quote because it's covered up on my screen. The edge of chaos is where new ideas and innovative genotypes are forever nibbling away at the edges of the status quo, and where even the most entrenched old guard will eventually be overthrown. So what does that have to do with you, with all of you out there? We're at a moment in time where change is happening, where change is upon us. And so we get to make choices, and it's troubling. And for a lot of people, it's a very dangerous time. People are dying. People have been dying all along, but people are dying right now in greater numbers. So the question then for you is, what are you going to do about it? If this change is going to happen, it's going to happen one way or another. And we have an ability, an opportunity to kind of direct that change. And so we can support some of the grassroots activities that have been going on that have been dealing with the issue of, like, how do I keep my community alive till tomorrow? But we can also work within our larger institutions and organizations to really change the way they think about what's important and where we're going as an organization. So, you know, some ways to think about that here, feedback loops, bridges between networks, and really pay attention to the emergent systems and pay attention to what you do and don't want to support. And then that's just basically the last conversation starter question. How will you apply this theory to your work and your organization? And hopefully, while I've been doing this, I'm going to switch out of my slideshow. My last slide I flipped by, that was how you can find me. But I think if you want to find me, you can look through the app here. I've got my LinkedIn out there. Another way to find me is beth@substack.com. Anyway, I won't spend a lot of time on that. So, Erin, do you have some questions from people?
Yes. So that was a great talk.
Questions and suggestions, conversations.
Yeah. Now I'm guessing all of my feedback loops. So it's like really makes you think about how you think. So, but Jesse Dirkman said, I really appreciate hearing your linear story, then hearing, yeah, that's not how it really works. Why are we drawn to linear way of thinking? Wondering if our brains are better at understanding things linearly, then if so, is that biological or cultural?
I think it's cultural, and I blame Hegel. So I've studied a lot of philosophers, and if you're a Hegel scholar, you can correct me on this. So anyway, I'm going to tell you my Hegelian mistake story. I'm sorry you brought it up. So anyway, Hegel was a philosopher, and he came up with this theory that we have a thing, which we call the thesis. We have the opposite thing, which we call the antithesis. And when those things are in conflict, they develop into a new thing, which is called the synthesis. So this is a way of understanding how to solve problems in society that's been around for about 300 years. And even if we didn't study Hegel, we've been kind of schooled in this way of looking at problems. Marx took Hegelianism a step further, and what he said was that when we get to the synthesis, it's always better. We're always progressing. We're always moving forward. So the short answer to that question is, I think we're taught in school that this is a good way to understand change, that this is a way to understand not only how change happened, but how to make change. And it's a theory of change that's been around since the philosopher Hegel, that's been expanded on by Marx and many other philosophers since then. And it is easy to understand. It's a simple story to understand. And so that's one of the reasons it resonates with us.
Nice. Okay, moving on. Carl said, thank you so much for addressing systems science and for shouting out to Santa Fe Institute. And he provided the link for everybody.
Oh, cool. Another Santa Fe fan.
And then Everett said, the response to George Floyd's murder here in Minneapolis has been very marked by well-organized groups that were able to mobilize people for action super quickly and well. Snacks, water all over, first aid supply chains, etc., which was very impressive and spoke to a set of really dense ties between them. So it was just a comment.
Yeah, and that's good. I mean, for any of you that were able to take part in the events yesterday and listen to the last panel on building coalitions, one of the things that the panelists talked about was the ability to do two things when you build bottom-up organizations, which you kind of have to build in the Black community, is another thing they pointed out, because the existing institutions don't work for them, and they don't work for the Black community by design. So you build bottom-up organizations, and that gives you two things. It gives you the ability to pivot quickly because you have all of these resources in your network and you're not just dependent on what you yourself can do, and the ability to scale, again, because you have this dense connections within those networks. So it's a real, real important thing, this bottom-up organization. And it's not an idea that came from nowhere. Building how to build bottom-up organizations has been something that people have thought about and worked on and developed. And you have seen those sudden pivots, which were immensely effective.
Yep. Yep. And then Jesse commented, there was a Code Switch podcast episode where a guest posited that COVID-19 created the conditions for such a strong uprising, that something was going to erupt, and George Floyd's killing was a spark. Curious how this theory could relate to these networks.
I've seen that. I didn't listen to that podcast, but I track a lot of things in my own work, and I've seen that theory that COVID had an impact, and it did. And certainly economic precarity had an impact. But the point is the way you look at it, the framework you put that analysis in, because if you look at it that all these things happened, and if you look at it as a cumulative, that doesn't give you the power of understanding it from a complex adaptive system framework. So that's my take on that.
Yeah. And then Dave commented that the silver lining in all today's challenges is the opportunity presented to everyone. And that's a great way to.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
All right. Well, thank you. And we will get your slides from you, and this recording will be available to everyone, and we'll put how to get in touch with you. So thank you very much, everyone. And thank you for being here.
Well, and thank you everybody for being here. And I really, really hope if we get an opportunity to do this again. Erin and I had a conversation beforehand. She's an introvert, so this is great for her. I'm an extrovert, and I really, really miss seeing your faces and getting your in the moment feedback. So looking forward to a time when that can happen again. But thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to talk to you today.
All right. Thank you, Beth.
Bye, everybody.